Welcome everyone to another episode of Playing with Unicorns. This week, as usual, we're trying to cover things I wish I knew when I was 23 and starting out as a first-time tech entrepreneur. To date, we've mostly covered things that, what to do, how to come up with a business idea, how to fundraise, how to evaluate your business idea. And this week, we're doing something different. It's like understanding why startups fail. Very few people have actually gone in depth to understand why, and we're actually privileged to have someone who has done that. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the episode of the week. So welcome to episode 22, Why Startups Fail. So Tom, thank you for joining us this week.
It's great to be here.
Thank you for being here. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what got you down this rabbit hole of like why startups fail?
So I've been a professor at Harvard Business School for the past 24 years, since 1997, and good chunk of the early part was spent studying platform strategy. But about 10 years ago, I took a turn into working on startup management and started working closely with students who were launching businesses. Around the same time, I had discovered Lean Startup, brought my students out to see Steve Blank and brought Eric Ries in as an entrepreneur in residence at the school, and had several teams that I thought were just terrific, encouraged them to start the business. One of them, Quincy Apparel, followed Lean Startup principles in just a textbook perfect way, validated demand, had a great idea, I thought, had confidence in the team. And they failed. And so here I was, supposedly an expert on entrepreneurship. I was a failure at explaining failure. And since, depending on how you define startup and how you define failure, maybe 2/3 of startups will fail, that seemed like a pretty big gap in my background. So it caused me to question whether I was teaching the right stuff or whether I was really as competent as I thought. So put me on a quest to learn everything I could about why startups fail. Talk to lots of failed founders and the investors who'd back them, do some survey work and so forth. And since things move slowly in academia, it took 8 years of research to come up with the book.
So here's the book, by the way, for everyone, Why Startups Fail by Tom Eisenmann, which I had the pleasure of reading the last week. And it's both a well-written, and so it's a reasonably easy read, but it's very structured and thoughtful. And I think everyone who's an aspiring entrepreneur should read it, especially since it breaks down all the underlying reasons and breaks it down in terms of like what happened, why they failed at early stage from late stage, which is rather different. So why, by the way, is a Harvard professor, McKinsey background the right person to tell people rather, why startups fail rather than a practitioner?
I mean, in the first place, a lot of what I know I've learned from practitioners. So, if anybody would go to the acknowledgments, so paragraph number 1 is thank you to Steve Blank and Eric Ries and Fred Wilson and Peter Thiel, and you go right down the list. A lot of the best ideas in this field come from folks who've cut their teeth on the problem. So that said, I've been working with literally hundreds, maybe thousands of aspiring entrepreneurs, have invested in a bunch of them, have coached them, have been on boards. So, if you, a lot of the best investors, and you're among them, have been entrepreneurs, but it's not hard to find venture capitalists who've never run a startup. I think Fred Wilson would fit the description. Jim Breyer would fit the description. So, if we don't require venture capitalists to be successful entrepreneurs, I don't think we should force a business school professor to do it.
No,
Bill Belichick, by the way, one of our greatest football coaches, wasn't much of a football player himself. So
yeah, and by the way, like I actually think
writing
a book, that's like launching a startup, right? Creating a class,
you bet,
it's like launching a startup.
I've launched 14 courses. It is. It's not in the sense that if it doesn't work, they're going to force me out of the school, and I won't be able to pay the rent. But it's a long project. Each course takes a couple of years. It involves lots of people. You have to generate demand. You have to guess whether the market's there, and some of them do fail.
Demand meaning
and by the way, most books fail.
Like this, because you need to attract students to the class, basically.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. The students vote with their feet, and to your point about the book, the vast majority of books fail. So we'll see how this one does.
And that's your second book, or or your first book?
It depends how you count. I taught a course on internet business models back in the boom, and wrote a case and textbook there. I edited a volume of other people's blog posts that I thought were really good ones. So that kind of counts. And then when the first time I came up for promotion at Harvard Business School, I had taken everything I learned about internet era, dot-com boom era, get big fast strategies, and put that into a book. And the folks who were trying to figure out whether I was professor material thought it was done in a hurry. So
It's interesting because if you apply the
ironically,
same principles of entrepreneurship to book writing, like be ashamed of the first version you put out there, an MVP, etc. I think most people, yeah, I can see why people in academia would want it to be slower and different.
yeah, yeah. The question was, aren't you the guys that were excited about how I filled up the classroom with all these people interested in internet companies? And that was done in a hurry too. So I actually put the book out. So I was told that as I came up for promotion the first time, unless you think everybody who reads that book thinks it's the most brilliant thing that's ever been written about internet companies, you probably shouldn't publish it. So I actually had a big advance from a publisher. I marched back to my office and said, where do I send the check back? And put the book in a drawer. And then essentially 15 years later, pulled it out of the drawer and looked at it and said, wow, my current students were in middle school when all this happened. There's actually a lot to learn from who grew too fast and in the dot-com boom. And sometimes that strategy paid off. A lot of the times it didn't. So that actually was an exercise in sort of figuring out what separates success and failure. The book is available. It's called Speed Trap.
Okay.
It's a free ebook. So anybody who's really curious about what it was like 20 years ago can go have a look.
Well, the times we are in are also, it's not as crazy as it was then. I mean, I was getting like signed binding term sheets by fax from people I never met. I mean, that's a bubble. So we might be in a bubble in the public markets now, but it's not a bubble in the tech startup early stage scene.
There's
right
really
now.
no comparison. It was insane.
Yeah, it was completely insane. And you're right. Most of the entrepreneurs I've backed who are in their mid to late 20s or early 30s, they didn't live through it in any meaningful way, so they don't realize how crazy it was relative to the frothy times we were in today.
Yep.
So why do
also my introduction as an angel investor, and I probably did 15 of them, all in late '99, early 2000. That portfolio, I think I got my money back on one, money back, not a return. And a couple others, I got 10 cents on the dollar. There's a whole bunch of goose eggs there.
Well, I'm sure most have done worse, right? Like most went to literally zero. So why do startups fail?
Boy, the easy answer is they run out of money and they can't raise more. I mean, there are some who fail because they raise too much money, but we can come back to that. But it's not a very helpful explanation for an entrepreneur. It's like the coroner saying, person died because of loss of blood. Okay. Was it an accident? Was it a gunshot wound? And so you have to keep asking why. And what the book does is it isolates for, as you pointed out in the intro, the patterns for early stage startups. The failure patterns are different than they are for late stage. So the book lays out three recurring common patterns, reasons why early stage startups fail, and then three more for late stage startups. And I think they really do cover, a lot of observers will pin the tail on the donkey by I'll stay with the horse and jockey metaphors, right? The explanation for a lot of people on why startups fail is bad founder fit, or founders plural. And there's a lot to that, but it's really, as I found in the work, an oversimplification. There's usually much more going on, and so what these failure patterns do is is isolate the sets of recurring patterns.
I'm sure all the
and
VCs are like, it was the founder, and all the founders are like, no, it was the market.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And we actually, in academia, we've got a name for that. Anybody who's taken a psychology course has run into this. It's called the fundamental attribution error. It's the first thing you learn in Psychology 101, that if a bad thing happens to us, it was not our fault. It was external circumstances. It was the situation. My co-founder dropped the ball. My VC pushed me to grow too fast. The regulators did something crazy. My competitor came out of the blue. I couldn't have possibly have foreseen it. And if we see somebody else do something bad, it was their disposition, their lack of skill, their lack of commitment, and so that was actually one of the challenges with doing the research. Is if you go to first person accounts, you blame the market. If you go to third person accounts, and in particular ask the investors, you blame the founder. And the truth is usually some combination of all of that, and there are patterns to why this happens. So the case study approach actually turned out, because a case forces you to sort of surround the problem and come at it from different angles, talk to the team, talk to the founders, talk to the investors.
Yeah, no, I actually think
So
in this case it might work well, because if you try to just do surveys, you're going to have that attribution error that's going to come through. Like all the founders will say, we didn't find product market fit. And all the VCs will be like, the founder sucked.
Exactly right.
So do you want to summarize the three for the early stage, maybe? We can start there and then
Sure.
Go through that.
Yeah. So the three are, the first one is good idea, bad bedfellows. And the premise there, I'll do them fast and we can come back and figure out which ones you might want to talk about. The idea there is the founders actually got a pretty good idea. The Quincy Apparel, the company I mentioned at the beginning as the motivator here, fits this description. Pretty good idea, but they never assembled the, let's call it a big T, capital T team, founders, other team members, supportive investors, and supportive strategic partners. And for a whole bunch of reasons why they can't quite get the resources together that you need to actually execute on the good idea. The second pattern is almost the photo negative of that. You have a pretty good capital T team, supportive investors, competent team, and they never find their way to a good idea. They're pivoting, but you can only pivot so many times before the money runs out and the investor's patience runs out and they won't bridge you further. So, and the underlying cause for this pattern is, I call the pattern false start. And the reason behind it is like entrepreneurs' identity. Entrepreneurs want to get going. They have a bias for action. It's how they view themselves, how they view the world. And once you sort of make the plunge, sort of quit your day job, your salary job, and start going, there's pressure on you to launch. And so these entrepreneurs are eager to build and sell. And they've got a vision burning bright of the opportunity, the pair of problem and solution, and they do it. They go out and build the thing without doing upfront research to sort of figure out, is the demand actually there? And of the many ways we might try to solve this problem, have we got the right solution? And we're not talking about years, we're talking about weeks, maybe a month's worth of upfront research that people just skip. And by skipping it, they've basically boosted the odds that the first version of the product is going to miss.
Yeah, I think it's especially true of product people and engineers who just want to build, right? Like that's their expertise. And so doing customer interviews and identifying product market fit, et cetera, doesn't come necessarily nearly as naturally to them. So we see that often.
Yeah, we can stereotype and say that engineers are introverted, so getting out of the building in Steve Blank style to go interview people can be uncomfortable. But I tell you, Fabrice, most of the MBAs I work with are not technical, but what they hear from everybody is you need great product. And how do you get a great product? Well, somebody's going to have to build this thing. And because they're skilled at networking, they can find their way either to a technical co-founder or somebody to run the engineering side of things. And boy, once you bring that person on board, particularly if you're paying them, right? If they're not a co-founder, there's pressure on you to keep them busy. How do you keep the engineer busy? Well, here's the vision, here's the specs, build this.
Yeah.
And, if you raise 18 months worth of capital, or, in a lot of cases, people are scraping by and they really only raise a year when they probably should have more than that. So if you've got 12 months of runway and you waste the first 4 months on a flawed version of the product, you can still pivot.
Yeah.
But now you've only got essentially 2 more pivots left before the runway has expired.
Yeah, no, for us,
that's a false start.
That's episode 10 of my show. Is like, okay, you have this brilliant idea. Episode 9 was like, how to get the idea. It was like, don't launch immediately. Like, what are the things you need to prove to be true or false before you go and actually launch? Then you hire the engineer, quit the job, and like pull the trigger. Before then, it's too early.
And that's why there's such an advantage to non-technical founders. It takes about 200 hours to learn enough coding to create a crappy Python prototype. And usually that's enough to sort of get some feedback. And by the way, it helps in attracting a technical founder. Like they'll look at it, they'll laugh. It's pathetic, but they'll respect you for having tried, and they'll actually.
I'd go one step further. I wouldn't even do do customer interviews, but B, just do a landing page that's like beautifully mocked up.
Exactly.
White code anything. Like
exactly.
$500, spend $100 in marketing. You get a sense of CAC. You get a sense of what people want. You talk to those people who signed up. I wouldn't even code anything.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%, and try to get every student team I work with to do that first. It works in B2C for sure. It works in most B2B markets too.
It works, in both cases, I think. And so number 3.
So false start, just like an athlete, right? Sort of a sprinter or a swimmer literally jumping the gun. Number 3 is a cousin of that failure pattern. I call it the false positive. Just like COVID testing, we're all familiar now with false negatives and false positives. And the pattern here is, boy, every entrepreneur needs the early adopters, right? If you're going to make the business go, you've got to find some way to attract them and make them happy. And it's often the case that the needs of you need the mainstream consumers too if you're going to build a business with any scale. And it's often the case that the mainstream consumers have different needs than the early adopters. And if the entrepreneur gets seduced by the early adopters and works really hard, which is a totally understandable thing to do to meet their needs and satisfy them, you can actually commit too hard and too far in terms of serving the early adopters and not have. You may have a product that's over-engineered for the mainstream. It may confuse the mainstream. Great example of this. I saw on your list of portfolio companies, the Dropbox is on the list. Drew Houston did an amazing job of avoiding this trap. He knew he had to test the product technically in terms of just understanding demand for it with sophisticated early software engineers who were basically on Hacker News, who really had very demanding and sophisticating requirements for file management. But he had in his head, you can read it in his Y Combinator application, I want to build a product that's so easy to use, my mother can use it to store her recipes. So he actually had the discipline to engineer Dropbox, so it was just simple to use. He took a bet that it would be good enough for the early adopters, sufficiently superior to what the sort of crappy solutions they were using at the time, that they would embrace it, and they did. It was a good bet, but boy, did he play that.
But what's interesting is I would argue there's some counterexamples here. Like think of Discord, right? Like going after these early adopter gamers and being completely hardcore, or Twitch. And turns out that those audiences are actually big enough that these early adopters pull you all the way through to multi-billion-dollar companies. And often you want to be pulled by those people because it means you have product market fit. Now, sometimes, of course, it's not big enough, and then you've built something that's not appropriate for the audiences. But finding that gold Linux, as you call it, like medium, is really, really hard. And all of these things, you're like, let's find the gold Linux. But I'm like, wow, like, I mean, true, but how?
I agree completely. I mean, I think the point is not so much that there's one right way to do it. It's that every set of early adopters and mainstream customers and every product strategy, it's just something an entrepreneur has to keep in mind. So you have to simultaneously figure out how to get and satisfy the early adopters and to make sure that whatever you're doing will work when it comes time to sort of cross over to the mainstream. And there'll be different ways to do that.
So
Sometimes you start with a product that's great for the mainstream, like Dropbox.
yeah.
Sometimes you really double down on the early adopters and stay with them and evolve the product or the marketing message over time.
So let me summarize
Just
what
need to
you've
think it
said
through.
so far. So for early stage companies, three main reasons they failed. One is bad bedfellows, meaning either co-founders or investors or partners or employees are not the right people. Number two, false starts, meaning you get going and it's actually not the right product market fit. And so you have to restart a number of times and perhaps you don't have enough cash to get to the correct product market fit. And number three, false positives, where you think you have product market fit, but what you have, it works for these early adopters, is not adaptable to the rest of the market. And so even though it looked promising, ultimately was not the right product, and you fail as a result of that. Maybe, and we should double click using old terms that probably age us on all three of them, but maybe give the 2-minute summary as well of the reasons the late stage startups fail, and then we'll.
Yeah. So, I mean, what was really, I guess, surprising to me is if your definition of failure is investors don't make money, which is one definition. I mean, you can come back to other definitions of failure, but if that's the definition, then a surprising fraction of late stage startups, and these are startups, let's sort of think of them as Series C or D and beyond, don't make money. About 1/3 don't make money for their investors. And these are companies that have had, at least at some point in their history, product market fit. They may lose it over time, and they've amassed a lot of resources, team, money, et cetera. And when they fail, they leave these steaming craters in the landscape. I mean, these are the ones we read about and hear about. Like when a seed stage company fails, it's painful. You may feel some pain, and the mother and father of the founder may feel some pain, but not too many other people hear about it. You know, when Theranos goes down, it's we get movies. So the three patterns are speed trap, and this is very simply just a company that had product market fit, great momentum from word of mouth, or satisfied early adopters, not spending anything on marketing, the thing's just growing. Investors come in at a high price for the equity. With an expectation of continued growth. The entrepreneur doesn't need her arm twisted, right? All the entrepreneurs want to grow too. And then bad things start to happen. Clones come out of the woodwork. Incumbent companies wake up to somebody finding opportunity in their space. The next wave of customers is rarely as excited as the early adopters. So you have to spend money to acquire them. They repurchase less. They don't generate word of mouth referrals. So you get an LTV, lifetime value, and CAC, customer acquisition cost squeeze, price cost squeeze, and your unit economics start to wobble. At the same time, if you've got humans doing anything, some businesses are pure software, so they scale smoothly. But many businesses have people packing boxes or answering phones or whatever. And now if you're generating all this demand, you got to hire legions of employees, which is hard to do. Think Robinhood a few weeks ago. And so you get quality problems and customer service problems. You also get cultural problems. You get old guard, new guard conflict. The old guard was present at the creation. They're mission driven. They love the founder. The new guard are specialists who feel that their contributions aren't understood or appreciated by the old folks. The guy down the hall who's got sitting on $5 million worth of stock options. And you get fiefdoms within the company. Different marketing points its finger at engineering for being late with the features. Sales blames marketing for generating crummy leads, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody wonders where the CEO is because he or she's off raising money all the time now. And eventually all this catches up with the company, the cultural discord and the economics wobbling. And people will pump more money in sort of under the assumption that people are going to fix things, but they just can't fix them. And it can unravel very fast when it happens. The case study in the book is Fab.com, which I think a lot of people will remember, sort of an e-commerce darling for a while. And then the wheels came off.
But do you think Fab.com could have also been a false positive rather than a false or a speed trap? Because in a way, the early cohorts were amazing. It's just that the early adopters loved it, and then no one else after that loved it nearly as much. So it feels like it's as much as that as it is as we grew, we had competitive competition. We got distracted. We went to Europe. We hired these specialists and was creating these wars. I mean, all this was true, but it just feels like at the end of the day, the early cohorts were the best cohort, the golden cohorts, and nothing, no one and nothing ever compared to it.
Yeah, no, you've got it exactly. I mean, the root cause is a false positive. But the thing was, Jason Goldberg, who's a pretty charismatic and amazing entrepreneur, was so good at harnessing the momentum, and he raised basically a couple $100 million worth of capital. So after the false positive, he could still play the thing out.
Yeah.
Most companies that are killed by a false positive are killed
Early,
before they reach Series B. These guys raised enough money to keep going and going and enter Europe, to basically go after the Samvers and the clones there. And so we see the false positive actually leading to the speed trap in this example. The second late stage pattern I call help wanted. And this is, again, a bit of the opposite. Whereas a company like Fab lost product market fit for exactly the reasons you say, sort of the later customers weren't nearly as good as the early cohorts. Sometimes a company can actually sustain demand, can sustain product market fit, but they're missing some key, let's call it a resource. In some cases, it's a key manager, a key specialty leader in a function. And the case in the book is another online home furnishing company called Dot and Bow. And they had a great formula. They actually had fantastic demand, repurchase, et cetera. And it turns out to be really hard to ship couches across the country. Can't arrive 2 days early. If your Amazon books come 2 days early, you're thrilled. It's got to be there when you're home from work, because I guess we're all home from work these days, but this goes back to 2015. And it can't arrive late, and it can't be beaten up, which big objects can get beaten up. And so they ran through 3 vice presidents of operations looking for somebody that could actually handle the logistics. And they bought the wrong ERP system because nobody really understood the requirements, and they couldn't keep track of their inventory. And so they were selling things that were actually stocked out, and they were failing to sell things that they actually had in stock. And they couldn't staff up customer service fast enough. So orders were being canceled, and they weren't keeping track of them. So it was just a mess. And the insult to injury was the other side of the help wanted pattern, which is around 2015. You'd have been in the middle of this. Investment in a lot of e-commerce categories just dried up really suddenly.
Well, Fab.com, Guilt, Shoe Dazzle, all those failures led to all the VCs saying, wait a minute, I don't want to be in this category. It's not particularly compelling. So yeah, I do remember that very well.
And this is just when Dot and Bow had stepped on the gas and was trying to raise its Series C, and it wasn't going to happen.
It's also interesting that D2C in a way is like e-commerce, coming back, right? So there's like this lull, and then it comes back.
Yeah, it happens a lot. Delivery services have sort of seen the same sorts of waves of up and down and up and down. Satellites in low Earth orbit. All sorts of things.
That's true. Nano satellites. I know we had Cosmo and Webvan, and probably the audience doesn't remember those, but Webvan was going to be Fresh Direct, not really Instacart, but really Fresh Direct, and Cosmo was going to be V1 of whatever, DoorDash or Postmates. And,
DoorDash, yep.
Yeah, but without smartphones and geolocalization and the ability to be asset lighter, Instacart is a better way to build it than
Chewy versus Pets.com.
Exactly.
And it keeps going.
Those are good ideas.
Yep.
Okay, so number one, we have speed trap. It's difficult to keep growing. You have the specialist versus generalist battle. You can't hire the right people. You have clones and competition. Number 2 is like getting the right people. Help wanted. So you need someone to do something, like in this case, ops, and they couldn't get it. And then number 3 is?
Number 3 is cascading miracles. I love this name. I stole it from a guy named John Malone. John Malone was the entrepreneur who built TCI, which was the biggest U.S. cable system company. And the concept here is lots of things have to go right for the business, for the venture to work. And if any of them go wrong, you're dead. And the chance that all of them are going to go, you need a cascade of miracles to make sure. And the things, so these are big, audacious, bold visions that often, almost always, they will have an incredibly prolonged product development cycle, just because you're doing, this was Webvan.
Yeah.
It was Segway.
I'd say Iridium in the satellite space.
Exactly.
Magic Leap.
Yep.
And of course, Better Place, which is the example you give in the book.
Is an example in the book. Yeah. But, so it's important to understand, sometimes it works. Federal Express in the 1970s was the biggest venture capital startup in history. And people thought Fred Smith was insane. Why would you put a package on a plane in Buffalo, send it to Tennessee in order to sort of send it back to Boston, Massachusetts, which is what they did. Hub and spoke was a newish concept. Anyway, so Tesla, SpaceX, Federal Express, sometimes they work, but boy, when they fail in a gigantic way. And what you need are basically fundamental. So Better Place for the listeners. Plan was a network of charging stations for electric vehicles. This goes back 10 years, more than 10 years. And when range anxiety was even greater, than it's still great today, but these electric cars at that point could only go about 100 miles before they needed a battery recharge. So the entrepreneur, Shai Agassi, was going to blanket the world with charging stations. And then these battery exchange stations where you'd pull in, like a gas station, a robot would pull out the depleted battery from your car and pop in a new battery, and all in 5 minutes. And they built this. They built it in Israel and Denmark, and burned through $900 million, proving that this was not a great idea. And so you need fundamental change in customer behavior, the support, in this case, of car manufacturers, right? Big incumbents who benefited from the status quo, who may not care to be steered around by a startup. Government, because you're often on fuzzy legal regulatory ground, and huge amounts of capital, and often just technological engineering breakthroughs. And if you flip a coin, so if each of those is a 50-50 chance, and you flip a coin 5 times, the chance of getting heads 5 times in a row is 3%. It's like spinning a roulette wheel and landing on a specific number. And so what you need is like an astonishingly charismatic entrepreneur who can spin the tale of why this, we're going to usher in a dazzling future, put a dent in the universe, Steve Jobs style, and so forth. And the charisma only lasts so long when the business starts to get in trouble. It's
interesting. Like, that one struck me as a terrible idea from day zero. Like I remember when it was first pitched, of like, batteries are going to get better. And I expected, by the way, that they would get better faster. I mean, the range has increased. Now you can get like 400 or 500 miles. I actually thought that the graphene type batteries or V-Flow batteries, where you can recharge your batteries in 5 minutes, would be here by now. And they're in the lab, but they're not in mass deployment. So I'm like, this is like an idea who's like completely temporary, and it's super complicated, right? Like, you need stations, you need like robots, you need a standardized system for removing and putting them in, agreed by the manufacturers. It's like over engineering for something that's going to get solved automatically by improving battery tech over time.
Yeah. And a bunch of things happened, and batteries got better, but again, fast charging didn't. You can still damage your battery if you fast charge it too many times. The interesting thing with Tesla is they actually they did a bunch of things. They put bigger batteries in bigger cars, right? If you compare the Tesla sedan, it's just a big car, which means a bigger battery. It could go 300 miles when everybody else can only go 100 miles because your battery was 3 times the size. And they actually they built battery exchange stations, same as Better Place. Turned out nobody wanted them. What people wanted was the fast charging stations, which they'd use on a long trip between San Francisco and LA or something like that. So they tried a little bit of everything, and a much more flexible approach, as opposed to, as you say, sort of committing to one solution and over-engineering that solution.
Well, that's the problem with the Messianic founders. It's like it starts being loyalty. It's like you believe in me or you don't, and if you don't believe in me, you're out. And then it's like self-reinforcing cycle of like, you only hear what you want to hear, and you think it's working when it's not. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes it's just you get your counsel from the mirror, right?
Yeah.
Basically you surround yourself with yes people, and then in the worst of instances, it can turn to sort of ethical lapses. And we saw that with not with Better Place,
Yeah,
but with
Theranos.
Theranos,
Yeah.
and exactly.
Yeah. So I actually did not double click on Theranos. Like, did she know that it wasn't working, and she figured they'd eventually figure it out, or not really?
It'll all be settled in court, I think.
Okay.
But if you read the book is amazing. The Wall Street Journal reporter did Bad Blood.
Yeah.
Everybody listening, I'd recommend. If you like these stories, I can't imagine a better researched and more fascinating. We teach it now in the MBA program at Harvard, and I thought it was a stupid idea because, like, isn't it obvious what the problems were? But boy, the students just love talking about this because you get into really interesting issues of the board's responsibility there was a whistleblower who made a huge difference. So it's a fascinating tale.
Interesting. Well, it's definitely on my to-read list. So why don't we go back to the first idea? So bad bedfellows, you're an early stage startup. What are good bedfellows? Like picking your co-founder is really hard, but you didn't mean just co-founders. You actually meant early employees. Maybe you can talk about what Quincy did wrong. And by the way, I was also an investor in Quincy, and when Christine pitched me, it was like literally the best pitch I'd ever heard. Like, I gave her a check in the meeting. We're like, you're going to figure it out. Like, you're extraordinary from a visionary storytelling. You seem to have identified product market fit. The early traction is really good. Why not? Let's go do this. And I was shocked that not that much later, 9 months later, it was over.
Yeah, it was fast. And you're exactly right about Christina. She's now my colleague on the Harvard Business School faculty, where she's just doing a great job. And it's fantastic to have her. She's very charismatic. She was paired with a co-founder, Alexandra Nelson, and Alex was just what you'd want to pair with the charismatic, the outside person on the team. Alex was inside, a disciplined engineer from MIT, who would be very analytical, who would run the inside stuff. And so the two of them looked like they were balanced inside, outside. They had a vision. They knew how to sell the vision. They also were best friends and resolved to never let the disputes over the business get in the way of their friendship. And that can be a big problem because basically you're going to have disputes between co-founders over the business. And if you can't work them through, you're going to slow things down or not make the tough calls. And so they clearly fell into the trap of just not sorting through. And they also, like so many, you'll have seen this a lot, sort of teams of MBAs all want to be the boss, right? They named Christina the CEO, but they actually functioned as effectively as co-CEOs. And they sort of had an agreement that any big decision, including all the product decisions, they would both have to agree on. And their tastes were different. I mean, fundamentally, the aesthetic, which is so important in a fashion apparel business.
What's interesting
Alex
is, though, here
London.
there are counterexamples, right? Like, there are a lot of co-CEOs that have worked out, and there are also I've even seen husband and wife teams actually work really well. When they don't work, it's a disaster, and it's like the end of the relationship is the end of the business. But when they work really well because they can kind of finish each other's thoughts.
Yeah, you're right. It's easy to find other examples. Here I'll lean on research done by my former colleague Noam Wasserman. He wrote a great book called The Founders' Dilemmas, and he did a lot of statistical work that basically shows, obviously you can find examples of anything, but on average, teams of close friends or family members are less stable, less likely to hang together. And he would say it's because they push away the conflict, they defer the conflict. So that was one problem they had. The second problem they had is, and boy, I fell into this trap because I'd seen a whole bunch of Harvard Business School teams without deep domain expertise, industry expertise, do just great. The Rent the Runway founders had launched a year prior. They didn't know anything about fashion or apparel, and they built this amazing disruptor. And in fact, the Quincy team had actually gone in and done project work for the Rent the Runway team. So,
that's funny. That seems to be like kind of an incubator for like other fashion companies. Like, I think Rebag, Charles also worked at Rent the Runway for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And there's a lot to learn there. And Jen and Jenny, who started Rent the Runway, are great entrepreneurs. So I looked at them and said, okay, well,
Yeah. You don't need fashion expertise.
this one's working great. We'll run this movie over again. But it turns out that as opposed to renting the dresses, actually designing and making them is a incredibly complicated task that takes a lot of specialty expertise. There's designing for manufacturability, there's sourcing the fabric. Fabrics have different elasticity, so you may think that the thing you used last time will be the same, but if it wasn't made in the same mill, it may just not fit this. And if your promise, as it was for Quincy, was better fitting apparel, and the stuff doesn't quite fit exactly right, you've broken your promise. Fabric, pattern maker, quality control, and there's like 10 different steps, and they have to fit together and coordinate the flow of work. This pair of founders knew nothing about this stuff. So what do? You try to find a co-founder who knows. You're not credible, so you can't attract anybody to do that. You try to surround yourself with advisors who can fill in the gaps, and they did some of that, but they should have done more. To build out the team, you then, of course, if you don't have the specialty expertise yourself, you go for specialists. They hired people out of existing apparel companies. Go to Ann Taylor to get your fabric cutter, Ann Taylor to get your fabric cutter. And those folks had no idea how to work in an early stage startup.
Those are the specialists you bring in when you're in late stage, they don't fit in the early stages.
In an early stage, you want jacks of all trades who can sort of shift from one task to the other, whatever fire, come and help put out whatever fire is burning. And so they hired for skill and not attitude, and ended up with a team that sort of sat on its hands when they should have been, sort of pitching in and making things work. So the team was off target. The founders lacked domain expertise and were fighting with each other. I think other investors, the folks who came in early, I think, were convinced by a great set of minimum viable product tests and these charismatic, competent founders. The next wave could sort of see that it wasn't coming together. So they had trouble raising the next wave of capital. And they targeted raising $1.5 million, only raised $1 million. That meant 2 seasonal connections. Apparel comes in seasons, so spring and fall. And so they could do 2 of those, but what you really wanted was a third to start to shake out the production bugs. They had a bunch of production bugs. Just didn't, while the sales were pretty strong and the repeat purchases were good, they didn't have enough momentum or enough of a clear signal that they could fix all this stuff to raise what essentially would have been back in those days a Series A. Now it would be a seed extension. And so they ended up with investors too that were too small, couldn't bridge, weren't inclined to bridge. And really didn't bring the kind of domain expertise that they probably needed. And this business probably shouldn't have raised venture capital. They probably should have found smart angels, or even factories will sometimes put money into new apparel companies.
Yeah, I mean, look, ideally, inventory you want to finance through debt. Though in the early days, you're not credible because they don't know if you can make money. So in the early days, you can never get that for it. So more likely than not, sadly, you have to use equity until you can prove it out.
Exactly.
So what's the correct gold Lilix match of the correct bedfellows? If those were the wrong bedfellows.
Yeah. So I'd say the most important thing here is understand as an entrepreneur whether you are or are not in a place where industry expertise, domain expertise is super crucial. Compare this to launching Twitter, right? You basically had a good idea, a good front end designer, somebody who could sort of run the servers on the other side, and boom, the thing just takes it. You don't need to know a whole lot of stuff to launch Twitter. You don't need to be an expert on how people communicate with each other online. You just need some instincts. So some businesses need the domain expertise, and then if you don't bring it as a founder, you better have a crystal clear plan for how you're going to get it, either through advisors or an investor who can bring it, or a C, a layer of vice presidents who can make sure you're not making stupid mistakes. And in this case, they probably should have just, before they quit their consulting jobs, they probably should have spent a lot more time studying the apparel business to sort of figure out how they were going to fill those gaps. And then there's diligencing your investors. And I think it's easy to tell somebody to do that if you're desperate to raise money.
Yeah, at the end of the,
It's
at the
harder
end
to
of the
have
day, if
this.
money's there from one person, you don't love them, but it's there, you
Yeah,
probably take it.
yeah, and then even the partners for Quincy, where the stuff gets manufactured, this is not uncommon for apparel in outside factories, and these factories would just push their stuff to the end of the line. Ann Taylor would come in with something that needed to be expedited, and it's okay. Those Quincy orders, because they had no industry reputation, no
Sure.
relationships, small orders, quirky sizing requirements, and so what can you do about that? Well. They could have given equity to a factory that might have helped. They could have maybe used a
Maybe
social
that
media
requires a
megaphone.
forward-thinking factory owner.
Yeah,
Eh,
and
yeah,
also risk. It's also risky
yeah,
because if it doesn't work out, now you got a messy cap table,
yeah.
and no way to divorce. So at the core, I would say is really and also the problem they had of not figuring out who the boss
Yeah.
was. That's one that so many founders avoid that tough conversation because it's natural. Like at the
Yeah.
beginning, there are two of you in a room for 3 months, and you sort of talk through everything. So it's very natural to extend that relationship forward, but it can also get you into a lot of trouble. So
Yeah, no, I
figure out.
don't mind co-CEOs, but you need to have like different areas of focus. Like one does like fundraising and marketing and product, and the other one does operations. More COO-ish type. But and you can agree on the core strategic things, but like things like design, there needs to be a decision maker. It can't be because otherwise you end up with like half-assed version of both that is not it's not distinct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and they did divide the functions up, but just what you're saying, it was product design where they both shared, they both felt they had responsibility,
Mm.
and
Yeah, no, that could
you
be a
know,
problem.
fashion, you're nothing but your design.
So number two, false starts. I mean, we talked about the people wanting to go and build immediately, but I could make the argument, especially for like really smart consultants and HBS types, you could also want to test forever. And so how do you find that good balance in cold Linux? Like many people I know, before they want to pull the trigger, like what they need to prove is basically unprovable. At some point, you do need a launch. So how do you come up with like the right balance?
Yeah, I have seen teams that are analysis paralysis, sort of too much studying. But boy, I think that's a small, and those folks are just not destined really to be entrepreneurs.
Correct.
And most of them will never pull the trigger. They'll do so much. If you do a lot of analysis, you can always find a reason why your startup idea is not going to work. So when they do too much analysis, they find those reasons, and something in their head, I think, is telling them you're really not destined to take this
So,
plunge.
so, so,
So
so what
they
is
can
the
use their
correct
analysis.
amount of research? Like what is it you think most people should do before they go and like rush to build something?
I think um, 20 interviews with people that are in your target customer segment. Steve Blank would want you to do 100. I'll live with 20.
Yeah.
And by the way, each segment needs a new round of interviews, and usually there's more than one segment you could be targeting. Um, a surprising thing that I see teams skip, which is can be done pretty fast, and boy, you learn a lot, is competitor analysis. And I don't mean like the moon charts where we've got this feature. You should do that, of course, but I mean actually sit down with a potential customer. You're building a dating site, have them log on to Match and sort of try to find a romantic partner and talk out loud while they're using it. And this is confusing, and the
Yeah.
onboarding didn't make sense here, and you can learn so much, and half dozen sessions like that. So I would say this upfront. Some places a little ethnography, actually watching people in the real world do the thing you're trying to do better, doesn't always work. If you're designing an online grocery delivery service, you can watch people walk around a grocery store. um,
I don't
so
love
so
focus
this
groups, to be honest, because you get one person to dominate the focus group and their opinions start becoming the norm. And it's like so, I don't know, like maybe watching individuals individually like use the product, but like focus groups, I don't know.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. It takes some training to do them well. You're right. They can get groupthink. They can get dominated. So you need somebody who can actually quiet the dominant voice and draw out the others. It takes some real skill.
Yeah.
Where it works well is products with strong emotional associations. And sometimes you can get people, if you can get the rhythm going, you can get stories triggered by other stories that, and I've seen it work really powerfully. But I agree with you. It's sort of in amateur hands,
Yeah.
it probably does more harm than good.
I think we do. We
So
tell our entrepreneurs the same. Like, do 30 interviews for each product that you're thinking of launching, like, and iterate, and then show them the mock-ups, test the landing pages, etc. Then once you, and we have our checklist. Like, is the TAM large enough? Do you think you have a value prop for the supply?
yep.
Do you think you have a product a value prop for the demand? What does competition look like? How differentiated are you from them? What do the unit economics look like, etc. And once you've done that, okay, now we feel comfortable. We can pull the trigger.
Yeah, and no, I love it, and I include in there a lot of I call them a paper prototype, right? You sort of a drawn version, not a software coded version of the product, and
Yes.
getting feedback on that, because usually there's multiple ways to solve things, and the chance that you're going to get it right the first time, and there's an art actually to doing that and getting feedback on it. People tend to tell you they like whatever you put in front of
That's
them.
also true.
So
Oh,
a good trick.
there's a way to ask questions. Like, you can't. It cannot be a leading question. Do you like this? Because the answer is going to be yes. They want to make
Yeah.
you, as the interviewer or potential entrepreneur, happy. So yeah.
Yeah. So what I tell my students to do is put two things in front of the interviewee and ask them which they like better.
Yeah.
You'll get much more honest feedback.
I totally agree. Yeah, and I can't remember if it's called the mom test or something like that, but like the way you ask questions matters a lot.
Yeah. No, for everyone listening, though, it's a wonderful book. Go to Amazon and buy it. It's not expensive. It's more wisdom in like 100 pages than anything you will buy on Amazon. And the premise of the mom test is, if you ask your mother whether she likes your entrepreneurial idea, of course she does, because you're her child and she feels sorry for you and she wants you to feel good. So don't ask, the point is, don't ask people who are going to tell you what they think you want to hear. And there's a lot of good guidance in the book on how to pose the questions and not ask leading questions.
Exactly. So number 3, false positives. How do you know and how do you identify that you have a false positive? Because when things start working, the last thing you want is like questioning, oh, why is this working? Is it going to continue, or did I just get lucky? So it's really, really hard. And also, you do want to build things for your kind of early adopters, and you want to please them, and you think they're going to bring you in the right direction. So, like, again, the gold lilacs of like figuring this out is really hard.
Yeah, I mean, you need the early adopters. So, the question has to be, is there anything about this situation I'm looking at that isn't replicable? Um, and so the anchor case for this chapter of the book is a company called Baru. I think it's a French word, Fabrice. A Baru is when a dog tilts its head, sort of listening for, trying to figure out what the
Really?
human's
I've
saying.
never heard that word. I did not know what that was, but
It's a great name. It's my favorite name for a startup ever. Unfortunately, the startup didn't work. Baru was a dog walking service like Wag or Rover. The wrinkle here was, instead of however Wag and Rover get customers, I assume through social, digital marketing, they were going to go to apartment buildings and basically have a relationship with the building and the concierge. New tenant moves in, and they're going to refer, somebody who's coming from a different neighborhood or a different city need a dog walker. So boom, and that actually was a pretty good idea, and that worked. The false positive for Baru, there's a building in Boston called the Ink Block. It used to be the headquarters and printing facilities for the Boston Herald newspaper. Big building, was all converted to condos, like all on one day, flipped a switch and filled up 400 units. And all of those people came from different neighborhoods or different cities. A good chunk of them were actually a Hollywood movie crew that was there in Boston for months and months, on per diem, brought their pets, working 15-hour days, so needed a dog walking service. And to top it all off, this was the winter of 2015, when Mother Nature dumped 3 meters, 9 feet of snow on Boston in 30 days. It's unbelievable. And so Baru just did amazing business with its first customers. And all these other buildings in Boston heard about this and said, we must have this amazing concierge pet service too. So she signed up another half dozen buildings just like that, and had thought she was going to slowly build the business, took some angel money, thought she was going to slowly build it to profitability before she moved to the next city. And now sort of the opportunity started to loom large, like, wow, it looks like I could raise venture capital and supercharge this thing. And so she let go of her original plan to sort of build slowly. Within a year, launched in Chicago. A year after that, launched in Washington, D.C., never really raising enough money to pull it off, and never having the operations under control to the point where she could actually build the business. There was good, strong demand, but
but that's not a false positive. That's more a nail it before you scale it. Like, before you put pedal to the metal, like, make sure that, like, you know how to make sure you're vetting the dog walkers correctly, you're managing your operations correctly. I mean, she made a lot of mistakes. I think she wanted W-2s as opposed to contractors because she thought they would churn less, but they actually turned out to churn more, or as much, yet cost a lot more because you'd pay them even when they weren't working. I think there's clearly a false positive there as well.
I agree with you.
Because
the false positive here was, I think she was beguiled, seduced by the strong demand at the ink block, and that gave her the confidence to scale before she sorted out these many, many problems you're pointing out. I think she'd have got there. She'd have just slowed down. I think she would have figured out that, contract workers probably were the right way to go, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, but the false positive might have been, like, this building in a way maybe was unique because it was only new tenants who had a lot of money, who all had dogs. And if you go to a building that has existing tenants who have existing dog walking relationships, and this is an important emotional connection, and someone's going to, trusting someone's going to take care of your dogs, replacing them is kind of hard. Right, like, so
switching costs are really high.
So it works better for new people in a building than so maybe there was a false positive, like, that building was rather unique because if I read the rest of the case correctly, some of the buildings that people weren't really pushing it all that much. Then the building managers or whatever weren't really all that enthused. They signed it, but then people's expectations of what the service was relative to what they delivered in the operational side was rather different as well. And then also Rover and WAG just came in, and that was a pretty amazing service that worked really well. And I think originally there was a funnel, the people were like, if I'm dog sitting, it's a different business than dog walking, but actually they're the same business because it's the same dog owners, at the same time skill set, etc. So I think there were a lot of things that got wrong there.
Who do you let into your apartment?
Exactly.
Yep.
Interesting. My brother is watching the show, and he says, Olivia Grinda, I actually participated in the feedback for your book. Cool.
There he goes, and he got a copy of it.
Great. Okay, we've talked about, like, bad bedfellows and false starts and false positives. Maybe you can go to the late stage speed trap. How do you avoid the speed trap? Because it's actually really hard. I mean, once you're growing really quickly, the transition of having generalists to hiring specialists and making sure they're loved and making sure your operations are scaling properly, all that is really hard. And again, finding the right balance seems very difficult. How would you go about doing it?
Yeah, I mean, because there's so many different problems, there's lots and lots of different solutions. But the real advice I'd give to a founder here is just basically, before you step on the gas and enter the speed trap, figure out what the speed limit is. I know this sounds corny, but I actually think the metaphor works. And the book proposes a test that I call the Runway test, RAWI. I love it because basically in Arabic, a Rawi is a reciter of ancient poetry. So there's something poetic about using that word to sort of help an entrepreneur figure out should they keep going, should they accelerate. And so the RAWI stand for ready, able, willing, and impelled. And the words are vague enough that you sort of have to define them. By ready, basically, do you have product market fit? But more importantly, can you sustain it as you grow? Because you're going to be going after mainstream customers and who may not be as interested as the early adopters. is the total addressable market big enough for you to continue to grow? And is your margin currently high enough to withstand the inevitable? We can hope that the margins are going to expand because of scale economies, but usually it's more often the case that competitive pressures and going after marginal customers puts pressure on the price cost.
So on the ready, by
margin
the way,
squeeze.
before we go to the willing, able, etc., to be honest, I've actually seen that as companies scale, the cohorts improve. For the most part, for most companies, the business improves because they get better at, they improve, they keep iterating in their funnel, and the funnel becomes more effective. They figure out the correct customer segment for them. They target them, and so if you look at like the first cohorts from when they launched, 6 months later, they bought 2 times, but then the cohort that started a year later, 6 months later, they bought 5 times because they got the right people. And so many businesses, I mean, clearly not Fab.com, but many businesses actually, I find that things do improve, and that when you see these things, you're like, whoa, yeah, absolutely, we're ready.
Yeah, that's a healthy business, and I mean, it forces you to sort of look into the future and try to be intellectually honest with what actually is going to happen. But you're right. I mean, scale economies should kick in. You should be leveraging your overheads over a bigger volume. You should optimize the funnel. So if it's really working well,
look at your cohorts. Are the cohorts improving? And if so, you're probably going in the right direction.
Yeah. Able is
because willing. I think everyone's willing, right? I've never met a founder who's not willing, like to go with big.
It's. I think it's still worth asking, because I mean, a couple of things are going to happen when you grow. You're going to take a lot more capital. You're going to dilute your equity stake. You're going to bring new board members on board. This is the point at which a founder goes from having control of the board, the dominant, usually a majority of board seats, to a minority. And now they can get fired. If they're no longer doing the job as founder CEO, they can get replaced as CEO. And there are probably some founders there who are more attached to the leadership role than they are necessarily to the opportunity to build personal wealth.
So what percentage of founders are no longer CEOs after round whatever? I mean, you mentioned that number in the book.
This again comes from my colleague Noam Wasserman, the Founder's Dilemma book. In his research, 60% of Series D companies are no longer led by a founder CEO.
Okay.
60
at Series D. Okay.
Yeah. And so it's quite common to replace, and it makes sense, right? Because the skills and attitudes and capabilities that let you get the thing off the ground are not necessarily. We can name a lot of founders who Zuckerberg or Gates. I mean, there are plenty who can manage the transition, but more often it's the case that somebody can't.
Yeah, no, I actually had a call with a founder yesterday, and he's like, "Look, I was like, are you being pushed out, or?" And he's like, "No, I'm like not. My COO is extraordinary, and my new CFO is extraordinary, and they're all in their 40s, and I'm 29, and I love the 0 to 10. He loved the 0 to 1, but he actually liked the 1 to 10 as well. But like the 10 to 1,000." It's not that exciting, and I think what needs to be done is clear, and these guys can do it. I'm going to chairman. I'm moving myself and like completely voluntarily, and that's a Series B company. And I'm like, wow, that's very mature and made a lot of sense, and like a lot of introspection and self-knowledge.
Yeah, and that's the willing stage. Sort of, are you willing? There are personal sacrifices. You're just going to work your ass off for another 5 years. And all of the problems you've seen in the early stage are just going to get amplified when the thing is bigger. There's more things that can go wrong. There's the possibility of getting fired, and so it is worth it. But I'd agree with you. And by the way, it's not always your decision as the founder, right? At a certain point, it becomes the board's decision about how fast you're going to go, and that's important to keep on perspective. Able is all about, do you have the team at all levels, frontline workers, and then managers, specialist managers who can manage the frontline workers, and the systems in place. You got to remember, an early stage company has nothing in the way of systems. managing operations, customer service,
Yeah.
managing the inventory,
No processes, no
managing the
playbook.
cash.
You make it up on the fly, but
And
eventually
they
you need
all
those.
have to be put in place. And the ones that make sense for an early stage company are not the ones that make, so they not only have to be put in place, but they have to be migrated. And companies can get this wrong. So do you have the people and the systems and the capital,
Yeah.
or can you continue to acquire? So that's able. That's a whole bunch of questions.
Yeah.
And then impelled is a tricky one. By impelled, I mean you're in a market context, a market situation where the competitive dynamics and the structural attributes of your business and your business model force you to go fast. And these would be the kinds of network effect business. So many of your portfolio companies are marketplaces that have to harness network effects. And or switching, when switching costs are really high, that will cause companies to race to get first-time customers, right? Because switching costs are really high, and it's the new tenants in the building who've never been in the building before. Switching costs are high at changing dog walkers. So if I can sign everybody up in that building, I'm probably going to keep them, and that will lead competitors to race to acquire. So are you in a place where people are going to race for customers, either because of network effects or switching costs? For sometimes scale economies drive this. And sometimes it's irrational behavior. Markets get overheated, and without those attributes, you still have craziness. And then as a entrepreneur, you got to figure out, do I to stay in pace with the crazy? Do I do it too, or do I hang back, conserve my capital? Assume these people are going to, all of these bike sharing services across Asia, that they're going to eventually crash, and then I'll be in a good position to pick up the pieces.
But some of the biggest mistakes, I think, people are impelled. They're like, they think it's a land grab when it's not. And if you go for the land grab and you burn every capital you have, and then because everyone's burned too much, the economics are underwater, you've subsidized either side of the marketplace. That's a good way to die. And I think, by the way, I think that's one of the reasons BP died, is like,